on the state of peak performance, or my body is a restaurant. My body is a restaurant, and there are different things that are happening that need to happen in order to supply, basically, the demand. The demand is people wanting things from the restaurant, in this case food. Now food we just see, or in this thought experiment, one can just see as units of energy or of tasks one can be doing. Now the restaurant might have a certain stuff. At some point of the week there might be deliveries to the restaurant. At some point of the day there might be customers that turn up. Sometimes there is more demand, sometimes there is less demand. The restaurant needs phases in which there aren't customers, so basically there are opening times and there are closing times. In the closing times one might get a delivery. It might also occur that during the opening times there might be a delivery, but if there is a delivery and at the same time there are many customers, then there is only one thing that can be served. What I'm trying to say with this is that stress, if one sees stress as basically the overall demand on the body in total, at a certain amount, there only can be a certain amount of stress. In terms of Garmin, for example, Garmin tells me there is 100% stress. Sometimes I'm stressed out if I'm very, very active mentally. I'm stressed out up to 99 or 95, or I sometimes take a look and it's like 80 to 90 for the last several hours, which sometimes happens if I'm on caffeine or something like this. Now, peak mental states are basically the states in which the restaurant, the body, is delivering everything it has. But it can only deliver everything it has if this task is priority. So if there are additional tasks that need to occur on a certain frequency, let's just say, okay, once a week there are no deliveries in terms of the food, and then you have these deliveries. They might also come in certain packages, and these packages need to be unpacked and they need to be stored in smaller units on the shelves, similar to how glycogen might be stored in the muscles in kind of smaller units, and they might also have different properties. So it could be that the fat, for example, does not need to be repackaged that much, but then it also does not give that much energy it might give more energy per unit of weight, but it might give less energy per unit of time, because there is just no process in which one can burn fat with a high of a power output as burning carbs. So now back to peak performance. It seems to be the case that peak performance for me, mentally as well as physically, happens even though both need to be, they are not necessarily connected always. It could be that my body has lots of energy, but my mind is just gone. Not gone, obviously, but is available to a lesser extent, or my mental availability is less there, or my agent 2, not my agent 2, but my system 2 has less resources available for computation compared to the body that has still lots of energy. So I would be able to go for a run, but not do something that is mentally demanding. In the state after I wake up, it seems to be the case that this is the state in which peak performance for me kind of happens. Now it could also, basically, there is a long arc that goes down from when I wake up in the morning to basically being tired. And then I am, in terms of body battery, one could think of Garmin body battery as kind of approximating this arc of basically going to the peak state, but also to the lowest low of one could go through in a single day. Now, basically, during sleep, there is an increase in body battery. The increase in body battery then results, maybe ideally, in a 100% body battery, which then allows peak mental states, but also a peak body state. After about 30 to 60 to 90, sometimes 120 minutes, sometimes it might go on for hours if there are additional systems that are kicking in, such as the dopamine system being very active. It might be the case that I'm kind of awake for hours. There is also something, if I use lots of my energy already for a workout, so my body energy for a workout, it seems to be the case that my mental energy also eventually goes down. And it goes down much faster compared to if I don't work out. It might be the case, for example, that I'm very alert throughout the day, basically on the edge of being just way too filled with energy. I need to basically release this energy somehow, but just thinking or just doing things mentally often does not do the thing. So, but sometimes there are also days in which I don't have energy for both, basically mentally as well as physically. But basically over the course of the day, what the accumulated or the compound metric that could be called body battery goes down. It then goes down maybe not to 0, but to 5, sometimes it goes down to only 25, and then it charges up in the night again. So what I can now also do is to charge up this bodily and mentally energy throughout the day by taking naps. And this also, for me at least, seems to work to a certain extent. So basically, I seem to have these cycles. And these cycles, at least, seem to also be known as ultradian cycles. So there is the circadian cycle, there is also the ultradian cycle, which seems to occur about, or have not half time, but have an interval of basically every 110 minutes. Now these seem to be derived slightly, at least, from the sleep cycles, but the sleep cycles also have a range of duration in which they can happen. It could be anywhere from 80 to 120 minutes or something like this. Maybe the 110 is just the average. Sometimes it seems. So what I have been doing for the last couple of years is I've been experimenting in basically how can I get the most out of my body to a certain extent, obviously. But what I've been seeing in myself is that, or I've noticed or observed in myself, is that I seem to have kind of a longer period in which I can be somewhat mentally very alert, which might be the first 60 minutes of the day, for example, the first 90 minutes of the day. Sometimes it's the first 120 minutes of the day, but eventually I kind of mentally at least begin to crash. Now it also might be the case that basically for a given demand of executing a movement function, my body then responds to a lesser extent if I'm more tired. So, and this occurs also, or it seems to correlate also with the mental sometimes. It is seldom the case, I think, or it might still be the case, but it is often the case that both are connected, and that basically my movement ability or my movement reactiveness, or the reactiveness of my body for a certain demand of movement by me, is then also going down in these states in which also my mental ability also goes down. And this seems to occur for the first time maybe after 90 minutes of being awake. So if I now want to work out, then I'm basically running against time to a certain extent. Today, for example, was the run, and I also did run against time. Now it could be the case that I then run after, so I am awake for 90 minutes and I still haven't crashed, and then I go on to the run and it is still fine. And basically today, for example, the cold additionally provided some alertness, and so I was able to continue the run and I just didn't stop. Of course, it's not that if I then start the workout I eventually just become too drained to continue to run, but if I go onto a strength training session in which there are more pauses, so it's not a simple, okay, I run or I don't run. Of course, it's also not as simple as running or not running in terms of running, because one can always try to run faster at any given moment, or try to run faster now with basically the same average increase for the next 20 minutes. It's also more difficult compared to just doing one anaerobic burst and then again being stuck at the same speed or even going below the speed, which then doesn't increase the average speed of the run or the average pace of the run for basically the whole of the run. So now, in terms of working out, for example, one could now say that it would make sense to try to not work out in a crash phase. Now, a crash phase is what I describe with basically lower mental and physical ability. Now, if I want to now increase basically my average mental ability, then what I could do, at least during the phases in which I am awake, what I could do is nap throughout the day. So basically I'm spreading part of the sleep. It's not necessarily that this is part of the night sleep. I'm often also napping, or I'm just not doing anything. Basically, my system 2 is not requiring anything from my system 1 at this point in time. So what seems to somewhat work is that if this is a sinus wave, to a certain extent it's not a sinus wave, but it's a sinus wave that goes down not in amplitude, but basically it's going down with a arc, with a decline. It's not like this, but it's more like this. And so basically the overall body battery is maybe roughly linear, but of course it also depends on how much I'm actually drawing from my body. And the sinus wave maybe goes down like this. So then one could also try to schedule tasks and to also do certain tasks in basically the peak phases, in the higher phases of the day. So first of all, so there are two results out of this. The first one is that one tries to do the most important tasks ideally in a higher absolute state of energy. The second is that now, if one has a higher absolute state of energy, there are also these up and down cycles that are smaller. And in these smaller up and down cycles, which for me happen often maybe in an interval of 50-55 minutes, what I noticed is if I'm able to basically nap in the crash phase, then I can drive myself up higher. Similar to how you might do basically an interval workout in which you do a 1 minute on and then you rest for an entire minute. One could think of basically optimizing the day, at least I think of this, as basically napping in between, so allowing actually rest, not demanding anything from the mind, and therefore allowing oneself to then drive up the amplitude higher in these phases. So basically I at least would like to think of this as, so if there is the integral that is basically below the sinus wave that goes down like this, then one could see the goal of napping as trying to increase the integral, i.e. the area under this graph, which would then result in basically how much of the mental and bodily energy one used in a given day. And basically the idea is now by taking naps here, or just taking rest. Andrew Huberman describes this as yoga nidra, which might also be not exactly the same thing, but I think the main commonality between different methods of doing something like this would be just not requiring anything from system 2, maybe lying down, not doing anything physical or mental. And so if one takes these rests, one is maybe able to drive up these curves then higher compared to otherwise. Not compared to otherwise, because of course one is also taking the rest, which in terms of if one, for example, runs and then rests and then runs and then rests, the average pace of the running is often not speed but pace, which seems to be maybe easier to calculate, is obviously also going down if one rests in between. The question is whether these naps then in total basically increase the integral. And if they don't, then they are maybe not useful. So one could think of two scenarios. One scenario is one doesn't take the naps. One could also think as basically sleep as a giant nap. So there is basically this large curve that is then this curve going up again. And so basically there is the sinus wave with also the day and night, not the day and night sleep, but the daily sleep. For most people that's the night sleep then. The question is, what is kind of the optimal thing? Now, in terms of basically, one could think of time as a continuous thing. In a certain amount of time, evolution seems to already have decided that a daily sleep, which happens usually at night, seems to be more beneficial compared to constantly sleeping a little bit. One could think of these cycles here, instead of resting at the bottom. So during a day, most people don't nap probably. If one doesn't nap, one is basically having less, so one at least has less of the peaks here, or less amplitude in the sinus waves, because the rest seems to, if one basically has one sinus wave, then what the rest seems to do for me is basically, if I take a rest, then it deepens this curve, but it then also increases this. So it increases the amplitude of the sinus wave. And the same could be true for sleep. And this is something I have been thinking about for quite some time now. If I have a backup service, an online backup service, then I can schedule this online backup that is locally done still on my computer, but of course these files then need to upload. So there are two different processes. The first is the upload processes, and the second, which might take away from my internet bandwidth, at least from the upload one, then there is also the process of basically this program running. Now if this program I let run once a week, then of course for this period there might be, the processor might be so this task is taking some portion of the available processing power on my computer. Instead, what I could also do is, so basically it's blocking doing other things at this time, because I cannot do many other things if this program is running, especially if I then have two programs or something like this. So the backup process, one could also think, instead of the backup as the regeneration process, one could also think of sleep at least as part of the regeneration process. If this happens on a time interval, maybe on a sinus curve basis, more like this, then one could think of this as an optimization in terms of basically the task execution over time. Now evolution has solved this overall problem of sleep now with a daily nap, basically. A daily nap that is during the night. The question is now, so first of all this here, one could also now think, or one could draw the analogy, what if instead of now backing up my computer once in a given week, instead I basically back it up constantly. What this probably would do is it would flatten the sinus it would basically reduce the amplitude of the sinus curve. So if this is a normal circadian cycle, with this basically the sleep, so let's say these are the 8 hours of sleep, which then increases the amplitude of basically the availability, or increases also the alertness. So the more tired one is when sleeping, not tired actually, but of course now I'm just using these words, the more alert one could also be while being awake. So the question is, to a certain extent now, would it also be possible to enlarge these intervals to sleep every 2 days and to basically then drive up higher? So this would be one question that results out of this. The question I have asked myself now, so first of all, back to the analogy of the computer and also this other thing. One now could think of a future, or not a future, just an alternative reality in which the backup progress is continuously running. This would also be true for my computer. Then I can use much more of my CPU constantly, which is nice, but it's also a certain portion of my CPU CPU's processing power is like blocked all the time. So I don't have this phase the rest of the week if I back up once a week, where I can actually use much of my power. So these basically increased alert phases at least in terms of their amplitude. So I basically have less of these. Now the question is it more useful to have phases in which one is more alert, sometimes at least, and to go into deeper phases of rest compared to just more like, so is it more useful to be more like a marathon runner that constantly runs, but also is never able to sprint that much? So if there is really something behind you and you now need to sprint for the next, let's say 2 minutes, but you don't have the ability to, because you are continuously running this regeneration process, which one could think of as constantly sleeping a little bit, then one just might not be able, at least in these phases, to do these things. One could also say, or assume at least to a certain extent, that in these phases, the most important tasks obviously should be happening, or maybe are happening. So if I have this crazy business idea in one of these phases, but I would not have these, if I don't have these phases, I basically have a lesser amplitude of the sinus curve for all my life, then maybe the business idea here and this other thing here and this other thing here is not happening, because I'm basically caught up in a state of basically limitation in terms of lower amplitude of my sleep-wake cycle. Now, the question again now is, or that I have asked myself, is how can I get my body into a more alert state, or basically how can I do something like this also during the day? And the answer to this is, or it seems to be, is that I kind of also nap. Therefore I increase the amplitude and ideally also increase the integral. If I increase the integral, one could think of this maybe as the used intelligence. So basically what I'm thinking of is that I increase my at least awake intelligence, also partially by basically similar to how one increases one's power output during a HIIT workout by resting in between, that I also rest in between and therefore increase my power output to the detriment of using basically less time. So I'm basically just redistributing the time because I'm resting in this time, and therefore I'm just taking, so basically if one would rest and during this time one had a certain power output and one would just redistribute this power output to the remaining time, one would already have more power in the remaining time. But then the question obviously is, what impact does this have? So even if this is basically a zero-sum game and one is just redistributing the otherwise power that occurred and basically redistributing it to these phases in which one is then more available or more alert, then one could still maybe assume that it is more useful, at least sometimes, to be more alert during a shorter period of the day and to have these rest periods in between.